should you buy? And which players should you sell before the trade deadline in your fantasy football leagues? What's going on, football fans and fantasy freaks? It's Mitch here with your trade deadline edition. Buy low, sell high for week 12 of the fantasy football season. This video is going to set you up with trade targets for the trade deadline. Players that will help you for the rest of the season, and players you should think about trading before it's too late. If that sounds good, spike the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to OwnersBox Fantasy for weekly fantasy football advice. If you need any advice, hop in the comments and let me know any question you have, any trade that you're contemplating. I can give you my opinion. I'll respond. Before we get started with my favorite trade targets and trade aways, OwnersBox is running an awesome promotion for just one more week. Kind of like trading for players in fantasy. You got one more week to make it happen. OwnersBox this week is giving away 500 free player pick entries. Only to new users who sign up, you guessed it, this week. Player picks is a more or less props game that is super easy to play and also easy to win. Use the code PP100 and you'll get a free $100 player picks entry when you deposit $10 or more. That's PP100, link in the description and the pinned comment. Check it out, guys, and check out these trade targets. Let's begin with the buy low players that I think you should add to your team before the trade deadline. Let's begin with one of my favorites to draft before the season. It's funny how we come full circle here on OwnersBox Fantasy. That player is Kyren Williams, running back of the Los Angeles Rams. Kyren Williams has been one of the best second-round picks in fantasy football this year, and he's probably set your team up for a likely playoff spot. But recently, Kyren Williams has been underperforming. So if you don't have Kyren on your team, now is the time to acquire him. Recently, he just hasn't been scoring touchdowns. At the beginning of the season, he was scoring 1, maybe 2 touchdowns a game, which it's not sustainable. But also a player that scores that many touchdowns, that gets that many red zone attempts in this good of an offense when it's fully healthy with Matthew Stafford, Puka Nacua, and Cooper Kupp is going to get touchdowns. That's how it works when you're the lead running back on an awesome offense. And the Rams are still in the mix for the NFC West. They're going to be trying to score points, and they're going to be going all out to win all of these games. Every single one is make or break for their season. And I look at Kyren Williams and I say, well, 22 attempts, 15 attempts, 15 attempts, and no touchdowns. That's a lot of attempts to not have a touchdown. That is very likely to regress to the positive, which is what he was doing early in the year. Touchdown a game, touchdown a game, touchdown a game. Who was the best anytime touchdown prop at the beginning of the NFL season? You guessed it, Kyren Williams, right? Maybe Derrick Henry, but Kyren Williams was right there, right with him. So yeah, it's just going to regress, period. He's a good running back. The Rams at their core and their heart, they love to run the football. It sets everything else up that they do in their offense. It sets up the play action for Cooper Kupp, for Puka Nacua. It allows their protection, that's been a little dicey lately, to be able to move forward in the run game and actually be able to take that pass rush off of Stafford. And then Kyren has always been a guy, McVay has always been a coach that loves to feature that running back. And Kyren is his chosen feature back. Catches the football in the screen game, good pass blocker, really shifty in between the tackles. His play has not diminished at all. It's simply the fact that he's not scoring touchdowns. That's really it. They've had a little bit of Blake Corum involved, but I mean, he's still getting 15 attempts a game, basically. So he's going to get in the end zone, and you're going to be thankful that you traded for him if you're looking to make damage and hopefully win that fantasy championship in the fantasy playoffs. He's got the Eagles, the Saints, and the Bills the next 3 weeks. Not terrible matchups. I would say the Eagles are probably most difficult this week. And then in the playoffs, he has actually pretty awesome matchups. In the fantasy finals, he has the Cardinals. In the fantasy semifinals, he has the Jets. And in the first round of the fantasy playoffs, he plays the Niners, a team that he actually put up 31 fantasy points against in the first matchup this season. So really good matchups in the fantasy playoffs. He could explode when you need him the most. The second running back that I would target, buy low option, is RAAndre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. RAAndre was another must-draft player for me before the year, and he's worked out, I would definitely say, for where he was drafted around like the 7th round range in most drafts. And he's been a pretty consistent per game, per touch guy. Like he gets a lot of touches in every game he has participated in. And it's really been a little unlucky for him in recent weeks, a lot like Kyren Williams. He's another guy that he's getting a ton of work, and it's on a better offense than you would think with Drake May there, because the Drake May effect has actually made the Patriots watchable and has actually made their offense pretty decent. But RAAndre Stevenson, just like Kyren Williams, he's like not getting touchdowns, period, right? 20 attempts on the ground, 2 weeks in a row, in a win and in a loss. Against the Rams, funny enough, and then also against the Bears. And it's not like he didn't have rushing success. He just didn't find the end zone. On top of the rushing success, he also sees targets in the passing game. Like the guy had 24 touches this past week against the Los Angeles Rams. 24. He's due for a touchdown. 4 targets, 20 carries. Okay? And then you look at the schedule that he has. It's beautiful for fantasy running backs. He plays Miami in Miami this week, which could be a pretty high total. I could see that being a shootout in Miami. The Colts, then a bye week. The Cardinals, the Bills, and the Chargers. The Chargers is probably the most difficult. Bills, slightly less. Cardinals is beautiful. These next 3 weeks are very nice, especially considering the location. He gets Miami, he gets Arizona, and he also gets the Chargers. But mixed in there as well, even if he's playing at home in New England, the cold is coming, which means more running the football, especially with a rookie quarterback. So yes, Drake May has made this offense better, more productive, more consistent. It's going to raise the ceiling of RAAndre Stevenson down the stretch. And I have a feeling that the Patriots offense is going to surprise a lot of people. And I think the Patriots are going to play spoiler against a couple teams down this stretch. I could see them outright beating teams like the Cardinals and the Colts and making their lives actually more difficult to make the fantasy playoffs, or to make the playoffs in general, and going to help your fantasy playoffs in the process. So Stevenson's catching the football. He's rushing the football. He just needs to get in the end zone, kind of like Kyren Williams. That's why he's a great buy low right now. A lot of opportunity ahead and good matchups to look at. Third buy low option. We're going to go to the quarterback position. I like giving you a quarterback to target because I find the quarterback position is the best position to trade. Like when you have a good quarterback that's playing really, really well and another team doesn't, it's easy to maybe downgrade at that position and get an upgrade somewhere else for your team. But at the same time, quarterback is more based on schedule, more based on matchup than I feel like any other position, which is why a lot of people like choose to bypass elite quarterback in their drafts and draft somebody a little bit later or play the waiver wire because of the matchup process. And when it comes to fantasy playoffs, I've always preferred to play the matchup game. Baker Mayfield is somebody that has beautiful matchups for the rest of the season. Tampa Bay, I could actually see competing for this NFC South crown as the Atlanta Falcons kind of fall apart. Tampa Bay might be surging. You look at his schedule. He plays the Giants this week, Carolina twice, Carolina in the fantasy playoffs, and then the week after they play the Giants, the Raiders. Then he plays the toughest matchup against the Chargers, which also could be kind of a shootout as well because the Chargers offense is starting to get it going. The Bucs defense isn't very good, and I could see that game being a bit of a back and forth the way that Tampa's offense has been playing. And then he plays Dallas in the fantasy semifinals. So fantasy finals, Carolina Panther defense. Fantasy semifinals, the broken Dallas Cowboys defense. The only tough matchup in the rest of the season for Baker Mayfield is the Chargers, in which a game that could maybe be the most back and forth game of all of these games. So Mike Evans returns, his number one target, his number one receiver. Now is the time to trade for him because he put up 8.9 fantasy points against the San Francisco 49ers, and he's been on the bye, so people have forgotten about him. Maybe they're sick thinking back to that 49ers game and saying, Baker's done. He was a fluke earlier in the year. He's the fantasy QB7 right now, but I don't care. I'm going to trade him because he doesn't have it. The Bucs are done. They're not going anywhere. We'll take advantage of that because Baker Mayfield has had 6 20-plus point weeks, including 5 in a row from week 5 to week 9, which included actually a game against the Chiefs in which Mike Evans didn't even play. So that stretch was primarily with Godwin, with Evans, but even in a game where Evans didn't play, he still had production against a very good defense. So Baker has just been playing his best football of his career, his most accurate, precise, and I would say creative football of his career. He's got Liam Cohen dialing up plays on fire, and with Mike Evans back, I think Baker will lead this team to many wins and many fantasy wins for your team for the rest of the season. So, perfect spot. Coming off the bye. Bad performance. Great schedule ahead. Buy Baker Mayfield. And maybe sell a quarterback that's more well-regarded with a tougher schedule like Lamar Jackson or a quarterback that we'll talk about a little bit later. Drake London, we're going to stick in the NFC South, is another player that I would buy low on. Drake London is coming off some kind of lackluster performances for London. 7 points, 10 points, 17 points, and 9 points in full PPR settings. That's not very good, okay? He's on the bye week right now, which gives you some time. And also, the bye week being right now, especially in the trade deadline week potentially, is ideal because if that owner really needs to win right now, he's going to be more willing to trade Drake London. He's going to be more willing to trade the player that's on the bye week. Because especially this week, there are so many bye weeks. Like everybody has a bye week. So definitely look out if you're looking to make a trade or to boost your team for the rest of the season for the playoff run. If you're already comfortable in that playoff race, look for guys on the bye right now because there's going to be plenty of opportunity. Drake London is one of those players. London has had some weaker games lately, but he's had a very consistent season. He's only had 2 games this year where he hasn't had at least 6 targets. The Falcons have an awful offense. I should say awful defense. It's offensive, and their offense is the only thing that's working for them. It's their only chance in these games. They need to score points. And you look at the rest of their schedule, they're trying to maintain that lead in the NFC South. As I brought up, the Bucs are chasing them. They play the Chargers and the Vikings after the bye. 2 games that I think they are worse than those opponents. So they're going to be trailing in those games. They're going to have to throw in those games. What I also like about those games, Chargers are a zone-heavy team, which I think Cousins will actually do well against. And the Vikings are a revenge game for Kirk Cousins. So I think the Vikings and the Chargers will move the ball on the Falcons, causing Cousins to throw the ball a lot, causing Drake London to catch the ball a lot. Neither of those teams either have shutdown corners. Still respect Gilmore, but he's not quite at that level. But in the fantasy playoffs is really where you want Drake London because he plays the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders. And I know that they brought in Marshawn Lattimore, his Saint rival, right? His former Saint rival. But the Commanders are a really high-scoring offense. They're going to move the ball in Atlanta, which means that game will probably be a higher-scoring game between 2 good offenses that are looking to win that game to make the playoffs, right? So Drake London is in a great spot. Hasn't played that well. Atlanta overall is a sell as a team. Like a lot of people are down on the Falcons. The media's down on the Falcons. Everyone thinks they suck now. So this is a perfect storm. London, not ideal performances. Perfect schedule ahead. A lot of good potential states for these games ahead. So I like Drake London to take advantage of the fantasy playoff landscape moving forward. The final player that I would buy low on is Deebo Samuel. We brought up Deebo a few times in this series before, and I think now is the time and the final time to buy on Deebo. Just as I brought up with Drake London, like a lot of people are down on the Falcons. A lot of people are down on the 49ers. A lot of people have considered them done for the season. They're washed. They're no good anymore. And Deebo is like the player on the marquee that a lot of people are suggesting is washed. So you could potentially get Deebo for fairly cheap. And the thing I love about Deebo in fantasy playoffs is that he always has that possibility of putting up a massive performance because he's Deebo Samuel. The way that he plays, right, is very explosive. And he can score multiple touchdowns in a game. He can have a long screen that goes for a touchdown. He can rush for a touchdown. He can do a lot of different things. And when you think about the 49ers, they do have a tough schedule ahead, but they also need their best players to play their best for them to make the playoffs. And every game from here on out is a must-win game for the 49ers. It doesn't matter who they're playing. They're going to be going all out. And this is a championship quality team in terms of their mental, their history, their makeup. This is a team with great coaching. This is a team with a lot of winners and a lot of dogs. And Deebo leads that dog inside the 49ers. And he's been a huge part of that team. Now, what I also like about Deebo is his consistency and his floor. This year, he hasn't had the explosive weeks that we would expect, but he's only had 2 bad games out of 8. So overall, the receiver position is very up and down, but Deebo is one that hasn't had a lot of downs. And his most recent down has people considering that he's washed, right? Like this last week, he didn't play very well against Seattle. I think a lot of that had to do with the matchup against Witherspoon. I really feel like that is the reason why. But they need him in this offense, and in the fantasy playoffs, he will really help you because he plays the Rams, a team that he historically owns, the Miami Dolphins, who I don't think have a great defense. I don't think we'll be able to cover him. And then the Detroit Lions, a team that will score on the Niners. The Niners are going to have to score back, just like the NFC Championship. So I think Deebo could have a big fantasy playoffs, especially if the Niners are needing to win those games. And who says they can't turn back the clock and do it? So buy low on those players before the trade deadline. My sell high options, let's begin with DeAndre Swift, running back of the Chicago Bears. I brought up Swift in past videos, and the reason for that is I'm not a huge fan of Swift as an individual talent, but he has proven me wrong to a certain degree. Last week, he had a really good game, but there were underlying metrics and suggestion to why you would want to sell him right now. Swift had 14 attempts for 71 yards and a touchdown, on top of, I think, 1 or 2 catches. And it was against the Packers defense. That's average, but he played well in fantasy. But a lot of fantasy owners maybe don't know that Swift only played just 57% of his offensive snaps. That was the second smallest share of his season. And as the fantasy owner of Swift, you should be aware of trends like this, especially when there's an offensive coordinator change that directly impacts that change in his snap percentage. Swift was a workhorse early in the year, but with Thomas Brown now calling plays, it feels like, and the weather changing in Chicago, it feels like Thomas Brown is shifting towards more Roschon Johnson. Roschon Johnson had 10 carries, 88% of the short down and distance snaps, 82% of the long down and distance snaps, and 67% of the inside the 5 carries, on top of 100% of the 2-minute drill. So he's getting the more red zone work, the significant percentage, the short down and distance work, even the long down and distance, and the 2-minute drill. So likely the third down back, the specialist back, has become Roschon Johnson. That's pretty much what he is. Red zone back, touchdown guy, third down option, pass catcher guy, and short yardage. So DeAndre Swift is everything else. Everything else is not good for fantasy. Unless you score an explosive touchdown, you're not useful for fantasy. If you're not catching the ball on third down and you're only resorting to first and second down catches, that's not ideal. And you're just an in between the tackles, in between the 20s guy, that's not going to be big time output for fantasy playoffs. That's not what I want on my team. So yeah, he's been good this year. He hasn't been great, but good. And he's been worth the draft pick. But given the offensive coordinator change and the recent surge of the Bears here against the Packers, where a lot of people, I think, looked at that game and said, wow, they looked a lot better with the offensive coordinator change, I think now is the time to sell him. Because I'm not sure if they're going to be able to replicate that with more tape of what they did with this offense. Caleb throwing the ball short a lot, getting the ball out quick, things like that are easily adjustable for the defense. But on top of that, I think that those Roschon Johnson things are definitely real. So I'd buy in and I'd sell him for another running back like RAAndre Stevenson, okay? Josh Downs, wide receiver of the Colts. This primarily has to do with my flat-out understanding of what Anthony Richardson is as a quarterback, which is a extremely inconsistent passer of the football. And I just simply do not trust any of his wide receivers in my fantasy lineup, in the big games, in the money games, because he's too inconsistent with his accuracy. I don't know if he's going to hit the target, miss the target. I mean, the guy can barely hit water if he fell out of a boat. So Josh Downs did have a good game. It's time to take advantage of that good game. 5 targets, 5 catches, 85 yards, and a touchdown, and sell Josh Downs, who a lot of people like, is a good player, is actually good at football, has had a pretty darn impressive breakout fantasy season, but a lot of it has been with Joe Flacco. And with Richardson, this is a more run-heavy offense, less pass-heavy offense. There's a lot of competition at receiver in Indianapolis. Michael Pittman, Antonio Pierce. Pierce, the downfield target. Alec Pierce. I knew it started with an A. I was like, why am I saying the Raiders coach that writes notes and I don't even know what he's writing? But maybe he's writing sell Josh Downs on his notebook. And then, of course, Mitchell, the rookie, who's also pretty good and is only going to grow in his role down the stretch because rookies typically do that sort of thing. But you also look at the schedule, which isn't crazy difficult, but Detroit is actually better defense than people consider. And I don't know, there's always a chance they get blown out in that game, and Richardson just looks inept against man coverage and the blitz of Detroit. New England has overall good corners that can match up with Josh Downs. I know their defense isn't overall that great, but they do have guys like Jonathan Jones, Marcus Jones, who are shorter, shiftier, quicker corners who can match up with the archetype of Josh Downs. And of course, Christian Gonzalez. He has a week 14 bye week, which is also the worst bye week imaginable. Then he has Denver, who has one of the best cornerback trios in football and one of the better defenses. Tennessee, who is like top 3 in yards allowed this year, and the Giants. So the Giants are a nice matchup in the final week of the fantasy playoffs, but you might be eliminated by then if you start Anthony Richardson's wide receiver against the Denver Broncos in week 15 after you lost the week prior because you had Josh Downs on a bye and you couldn't use him in week 14. You know what I'm saying? So Josh Downs, I would sell. Too inconsistent of a quarterback, unidentifiable role moving forward in my opinion, unidentifiable usage, not a lot of consistency, not a good situation for fantasy. Joe Burrow. Sell. I love Joe Burrow. He's one of the 4 best quarterbacks in the NFL. No doubt about it. And right now, he's actually a top 2 fantasy quarterback. But I already told you should sell Joe Burrow last week. And I'm doubling down here because of the schedule. Flat out. He plays Pittsburgh. He plays Tennessee, who we just discussed is a very good defense. And we've seen Tennessee play the Bengals a lot before in the past. And I know it's not the same coach and all the same players, but Joe Burrow's never played well in that game. Cleveland in week 16, you might as well just sign up for a loss in your fantasy semifinal if you're playing Joe Burrow against Cleveland. Historically bad in those games. And then Denver in the fantasy finals. So that's what it's all about for me. For a pocket quarterback like Joe Burrow, yes, like Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, they'll probably still thrive, but the consistency from Burrow and the high-octane performances are probably not there much longer. Pittsburgh, Tennessee, Cleveland, Denver, 4 out of the next 5 weeks. Those are 4 of the top 12 defenses in the NFL. And one matchup in the fantasy semifinals that he historically struggles with. So I would sell Joe Burrow maybe for Baker plus, right? Get a good schedule with your quarterback, Baker Mayfield, and maybe get another player that can help you or an upgrade at another position that can help you out. This one is bold, but I'm going to suggest to sell Joe Mixon, right? You're not watching this video for some lackluster advice. I'm going to be a little bold with my advice here. And Joe Mixon has been an absolute baller for your fantasy team, and it is very difficult to trade him. But what if I told you that Joe Mixon in the biggest weeks of your fantasy season, fantasy finals, fantasy semifinals, plays the 2 best teams against the running back position? I don't know how often that's happened, but it is a real thing. Joe Mixon plays the Chiefs and the Ravens in week 16 and week 17. No team has allowed fewer points per game to running backs than Kansas City. And only one running back has reached 60 rushing yards against the Ravens all year. No one has exceeded 63 rushing yards against the Ravens. So yeah, Mixon's a touchdown scoring machine. Right now he's getting a ton of attempts and a ton of touches. But if you want to maximize your elite RB1, I would actually move off of Mixon for another RB1 or a wide receiver 1 or another elite player that can help you. Don't sell him for some bum or a package of bums, but sell him for another really good player or a combination of good players that can upgrade your team. Be smart with this trade, but understand if you can find a player of Mixon's caliber with a slightly easier schedule And hopefully the guy that's trading for Mixon doesn't realize the matchups that he has ahead. He also has a week 14 bye, which, like I've suggested already, sucks if you're like on the borderline of making the playoffs, because you will need your best player on your team or your second best player to be in your lineup to win that week. So Joe Mixon, I would sell. And the final sell is Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill had the best week of his fantasy season since week 1. You heard that right. It was his first 15-plus point fantasy game since week 1. That's embarrassing for Tyreek Hill. I understand that Tua's been injured, but it hasn't been a good year for Tyreek. He has a wrist injury that's also been bothering him, and he's been vocal about that. And he doesn't play a great schedule for the rest of the season. He plays a lot of really good cornerbacks in particular. This week, he plays Christian Gonzalez. The week after, he probably plays Jair Alexander. The week after that, he plays Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. The week after that, he plays Derek Stingley. The week after that, he plays Charvarius Ward and Lenore. And the week after that, he plays Denzel Ward. So you're looking at probably 3 top 10 defenses in the fantasy playoffs, the Texans, the Niners, and the Browns. You're looking at 3 really good corners on the outside that will be covering Tyreek Hill. Plus, Miami has kind of shifted what they're doing offensively. They've ran the ball more, they're throwing more to their running backs, and they're throwing more to their tight ends like Jonnu Smith. Tyreek has become less of a manufactured player in the offense. And I think that's partly due to the wrist injury that's been bothering him. So I would trade Tyreek. He has a huge name. Obviously, the explosiveness, the big-time output is always there with Tyreek, which is enticing to any fantasy owner. It's going to make him easy to sell. But don't undersell him. Try to sell him for what he's worth. But understand that this year, he has not been a wide receiver 1. Understand that, okay? Those are my buy lows. Those are my sell highs for the trade deadline. Hope you guys enjoyed. Spike the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to OwnersBox Fantasy for all the future fantasy football content. It's Mitch. Good luck. Deuces.